Wisconsin father and son uncover century-old secret that local authorities tried to hide. The ancient chest they found in an abandoned barn contained evidence that rewrote their family history and left a wealthy estate owner desperate to silence them. You won't believe what they found inside. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments. If this mysterious barn discovery has you intrigued, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss how this incredible story unfolds. What would you do if you found a locked chest on abandoned property? Let us know in the comments. The October wind whistled through the skeletal branches of maple trees as Jack Miller turned his pickup truck onto the gravel road leading to his childhood home. At 42, the lines around his eyes had deepened, his sandy brown hair now streaked with gray, a map of the difficult journey he'd traveled. Beside him, his 14-year-old son Dylan fidgeted with his smartphone, occasionally glancing at the unfamiliar rural Wisconsin landscape scrolling past their windows. "Dad, how much longer?" Dylan asked, his voice carrying the characteristic impatience of adolescence. "There's literally no internet out here." Jack glanced at his son, noting the boy's city clothes and carefully styled hair, so different from his own upbringing in Oakfield, population 978. "About 10 minutes. And yes, the internet's spotty. That's kind of the point of coming out here, kiddo. Disconnect a little." Dylan rolled his eyes but put his phone down. "So this is where you grew up? It's so empty." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of memories press against his chest. "Yep. Left when I was 18 and swore I'd never come back. Funny how life works." The truth was more complicated. After his father's death 2 weeks ago, Jack had inherited the family farm, 30 acres of land, a weathered farmhouse, and a mountain of memories he'd spent 24 years running from. As a successful architect in Minneapolis, returning to rural Wisconsin was the last thing he'd planned. But the divorce last year had left him drained, both emotionally and financially. Dylan needed stability, and property values in Oakfield had risen as city folks sought country retreats. "We're just here to fix up the place and sell it," Jack reminded his son, and perhaps himself. 6 weeks, tops. As they rounded the final curve, the old Miller farmhouse came into view, a 2-story white clapboard structure that seemed to sag under the weight of decades. The red barn behind it leaned slightly to the left, its paint faded to a rusty pink. Fields stretched behind it, golden with autumn. "That's it. That's where we're staying." Dylan's face fell. "It looks like something from a horror movie." Jack forced a smile. "It's got character. And hey, your grandfather built that house with his own hands." "The grandfather I never met because you guys didn't speak," Dylan said pointedly. Jack's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "It's complicated, Dylan. Adults sometimes, well, we make mistakes. Your grandfather and we had our differences." As they pulled into the gravel driveway, a figure emerged from the porch. Margaret Wilson, the elderly neighbor who'd been keeping an eye on the place. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and despite being well into her 70s, she stood straight as a cornstalk. "Jack Miller," she called, her face breaking into a warm smile. "Look at you, all grown up and city-fied." Jack stepped out of the truck, feeling suddenly like that 18-year-old boy again. "Hello, Mrs. Wilson, thank you for looking after the place." "Margaret, please, Mrs. Wilson makes me feel ancient." She turned her attention to Dylan, who had reluctantly exited the truck. "And this must be your boy, my word. He's the spitting image of you at that age." Dylan shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Hi. I've left some chicken pot pie in the refrigerator," Margaret said. "And the power and water are on. Place needs a good dusting, but it's livable." Jack nodded gratefully. "You didn't have to do that. Neighbors help neighbors around here, Jack. You remember how it works." Her expression softened. "Your father would be glad you came back, even if it's just to sell the place." Jack swallowed hard, unprepared for the emotion that simple statement stirred. "Yeah, well, I'll let you get settled. Come by for coffee tomorrow." Margaret patted his arm and headed toward her car. "Oh, and Jack, watch out for that third step on the porch. It's still loose, just like when you were a boy." After she drove away, Jack and Dylan stood in silence, taking in their temporary home. "So," Dylan said finally, "do I at least get my own room?" Jack laughed, grateful for the break in tension. 4 bedrooms, kiddo. Take your pick." They spent the remainder of the afternoon unloading their belongings and exploring the house. Dylan claimed the largest upstairs bedroom, while Jack avoided his childhood room altogether, opting instead for the downstairs guest room. Every object seemed to hold a memory. His mother's china still arranged in the dining room cabinet, his father's reading glasses on the side table as if he'd just set them down. That evening, as they ate Margaret's pot pie at the scarred kitchen table, Dylan seemed pensive. "Dad, why did you and Grandpa stop talking?" Jack set down his fork, considering his words carefully. "Your grandfather was traditional. When I told him I wanted to be an architect instead of taking over the farm, he took it personally, said I was throwing away generations of family legacy." He sighed. "We both said things we shouldn't have. But 24 years? That's a long time to stay mad." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of wasted years. "Pride is a dangerous thing, Dylan. Remember that." Later, as Dylan showered upstairs, Jack stood on the porch nursing a glass of his father's whiskey. The stars blazed overhead in a way they never did in Minneapolis, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted softly. "I'm back, Dad," he whispered to the night air, "for whatever that's worth now." Hey everyone, if you're enjoying this story of family secrets and reconciliation, take a second to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your town in the comments below. Morning arrived with the sound of a rooster crowing, something Jack had forgotten about country living. He found Dylan already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal, looking surprisingly alert. "There's a rooster," Dylan stated flatly. "Why is there a rooster?" Jack chuckled as he poured himself coffee. "Probably belongs to the Hansons down the road. Sound travels out here." Dylan spooned another mouthful of cereal. "I was thinking, maybe we could explore the barn today. If we're fixing this place up to sell, we should know what we're dealing with, right?" Jack raised an eyebrow, surprised by his son's initiative. "That's actually a really good idea. We'll need to inventory everything anyway." After breakfast, they made their way across the dew-dampened grass to the barn. Jack pulled open the heavy wooden door, which protested with a dramatic creak. "Definitely needs WD-40, he muttered, as dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through gaps in the roof. The interior was a time capsule. His father's red tractor sat in one corner, farm implements hung from walls, and haylofts loomed overhead. The smell of hay, motor oil, and decades of agricultural work filled Jack's nostrils, triggering memories he thought he'd forgotten. "Whoa," Dylan said, his voice hushed with unexpected awe. "This is actually kind of cool." Jack watched as his son wandered through the barn, examining old tools with genuine interest. Something warmed in his chest, a connection to his own childhood excitement about the mysterious treasures the barn had held. "Your great-grandfather built this barn in 1932, Jack found himself saying. "During the Great Depression. Everyone said he was crazy to expand when times were so tough, but he believed better days were coming." Dylan ran his hand along the solid beam. "Was he right?" "Yeah, he was. The farm prospered while others failed." Jack smiled at the memory. Grandpa Howard always said it was because he built with faith instead of fear. They spent the morning sorting through decades of accumulated tools, equipment, and forgotten projects. Jack was surprised by Dylan's work ethic. The boy who complained about taking out the trash in Minneapolis worked steadily, asking intelligent questions about the farm implements they discovered. "Dad, what's through that door?" Dylan asked around noon, pointing to a small door almost hidden behind stacked hay bales. Jack frowned. "I'm not sure. I don't remember that door at all." Together they moved the hay bales, revealing a weathered door with a rusted handle. Jack pulled it open, revealing a small room he'd never seen before. Dust-covered shelves lined the walls, holding mason jars, old ledgers, and various containers. "It's some kind of storage room," Jack said, stepping inside. "Look at this," Dylan called, pointing to something beneath an old horse blanket in the corner. Jack helped him pull away the heavy fabric, revealing a wooden chest approximately 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. It was crafted of dark wood with iron bands across it and secured with a substantial padlock. "It's locked," Dylan said, trying the padlock. "What do you think is inside?" Jack knelt beside the chest, running his fingers over the smooth wood. "I have no idea. I never knew this room existed, let alone this chest." The craftsmanship was exquisite. Not something made locally, Jack was certain. The wood appeared to be mahogany, and decorative scrollwork adorned the corners. Whatever it wasn't a typical farmer's storage container. "We need to open it," Dylan said. excitement evident in his voice. "Maybe there's buried treasure." Jack laughed. "I doubt that. Probably just old family papers or something. But we do need to open it." "You're right." He examined the padlock more closely. "This is old but solid. We'll need bolt cutters." They returned to the house for lunch, both preoccupied with thoughts of the mysterious chest. As they ate sandwiches on the porch, Jack noticed a black SUV driving slowly past the property, the driver clearly examining the house before continuing down the road. "Probably just someone interested in buying the place," Jack said, more to himself than to Dylan. After lunch, they drove into town for supplies. Oakfield's main street looked much the same as Jack remembered. The general store, post office, small diner and hardware store all maintaining their places, though the hardware store now sported a sign reading Oakfield Hardware and Electronics, a nod to changing times. Inside the hardware store, Jack was greeted by a balding man with a substantial belly and a warm smile. "Jack Miller, I heard you were back in town." It took Jack a moment to place him. "Tommy Pearson? You run the hardware store now?" Tommy laughed. "Going on 15 years, took over from my dad just like he did from his." He glanced at Dylan. "And this must be your boy." Dylan nodded politely. "I'm Dylan. Got your dad's eyes, that's for sure." Tommy turned back to Jack. "Sorry about your father, Jack. Frank was a good man." Jack nodded, unsure how to respond. "Thanks, Tommy. We're just here to fix up the place to sell." Something flickered across Tommy's face. Disappointment, perhaps. "Well, that's a shame. Not many original families left in Oakfield these days. Lots of weekenders from the city buying up property." He gestured around the store. "What can I help you with?" Jack collected the supplies they needed: paint, brushes, cleaning materials, and a sturdy pair of bolt cutters. As Tommy rang up their purchases, he lowered his voice. "Just so you know, Jack, there's been some interest in your property already. Douglas Wheaton's been asking around about it." Jack frowned. "Douglas Wheaton? I don't think I know him. Moved here about 10 years ago. Bought up the old Henderson place and 3 other farms since then. Big shot from Chicago, made his money in real estate development." Tommy's expression was carefully neutral. "Just thought you should know." On the drive back to the farm, Jack pondered Tommy's words. "Sounds like this Wheaton guy is buying up local properties." Dylan shrugged. "Isn't that good for us if we're selling?" "Maybe. Just seems odd that he'd be interested before we've even put it on the market." When they returned to the farm, Jack was surprised to find a sleek black Mercedes parked in the driveway. A tall man in his 60s, dressed in an expensive-looking sport coat despite the rural setting, stood examining the exterior of the house. "Can I help you?" Jack called as he stepped from his truck. The man turned, offering a practiced smile and an extended hand. "You must be Jack Miller. I'm Douglas Wheaton. I was just admiring your property." Jack shook his hand cautiously. "How did you know I'd be here?" Wheaton waved dismissively. "Small towns. News travels fast. I heard you'd returned to settle your father's estate." His gaze shifted to the barn, lingering there. "I'd like to make you an offer on the property. A generous one." "We haven't even decided to sell yet," Jack said, though this wasn't entirely true. "I understand, but when you do, I'd like first consideration." Wheaton produced a business card from his pocket. "I've been developing properties in the area. Your land has particular appeal due to its location." Jack accepted the card, noting the embossed lettering and heavy stock. "I'll keep that in mind, Mr. Wheaton." Wheaton nodded, then looked past Jack to Dylan, who was unloading supplies from the truck. "Your son?" "Yes, that's Dylan." "Wonderful to see family connections." Wheaton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The land has stories to tell, Mr. Miller. Sometimes it's best to let old stories rest, don't you agree?" Before Jack could respond, Wheaton was walking to his car. "Call me when you're ready to discuss terms." As the Mercedes disappeared down the driveway, Dylan joined his father. "Who was that?" "Douglas Wheaton. Apparently he wants to buy our property." Dylan frowned. "He seems intense." "Yeah," Jack agreed, staring after the dust trail left by Wheaton's car. "Let's go open that chest." If you're enjoying this mysterious discovery, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. What do you think Jack and Dylan will find in that locked chest? Share your predictions in the comments below. Back in the barn, Jack positioned the bolt cutters around the shackle of the padlock, while Dylan watched expectantly. With a firm squeeze, the lock broke open with a satisfying snap. "Moment of truth," Jack said, removing the broken lock. He lifted the lid slowly, half expecting it to be empty after all the build-up. It wasn't empty. The chest contained several items, carefully arranged: On top was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Beneath it lay a stack of letters, tied with faded blue ribbon, a small wooden box, several black and white photographs, and what appeared to be legal documents. "Whoa," Dylan breathed. "This is like a movie." Jack carefully lifted out the journal, opening it to the first page. The handwriting was neat and precise. The ink faded to sepia. "Property of Elizabeth Sinclair Miller, 1928, he read aloud. "Who's Elizabeth Miller?" Dylan asked, peering over his shoulder. Jack shook his head. "I'm not sure. Maybe a great-aunt. I don't remember Dad ever mentioning an Elizabeth." He flipped through a few pages, scanning the elegant script. "This seems to be a personal diary." While Jack examined the journal, Dylan reached for the wooden box. It was about the size of a paperback book, with intricate carvings on the lid. He opened it carefully, revealing a delicate gold locket on a chain, along with several folded documents. "Dad, look at this," Dylan said, holding up the locket. Jack set the journal aside and took the necklace, clicking open the locket to reveal two tiny photographs, a handsome young man in a World War I uniform on one side and a beautiful young woman on the other. "I think that might be your great-grandfather Howard," Jack said, studying the man's face, "but I don't recognize the woman." They continued exploring the contents of the chest. The photographs showed scenes from the farm in its early days, along with pictures of people Jack didn't recognize. The legal documents appeared to be property deeds, certificates, and what looked like correspondence with a bank. "Dad, check this out," Dylan said, unfolding one of the documents from the wooden box. "It looks like a marriage certificate." Jack took the yellowed paper, reading aloud. "This certifies that Howard James Miller and Elizabeth Catherine Sinclair were joined in matrimony on June 12, 1927, in Cook County, Illinois." Dylan frowned. "But I thought Great-Grandpa was married to Great-Grandma Martha." "He was," Jack confirmed, confusion evident in his voice. "At least, that's what Dad always told me. Martha died before I was born." They spread the contents on the barn floor, piecing together a story neither had expected. According to the documents and diary entries, Howard Miller had indeed married Elizabeth Sinclair in 1927. She had apparently come from a wealthy Chicago family, and their marriage had been kept secret for reasons not immediately clear from the documents. "Listen to this entry," Jack said, reading from the journal dated October 3, 1928. "Howard believes we can finally tell his parents about our marriage now that the baby is coming. He says his father will be angry at first, but the prospect of a grandchild will soften the blow. I'm not so certain. The telegram from Father yesterday was clear. If I do not return to Chicago immediately and end this farmer fantasy, as he calls it, I will be disinherited entirely. How can I choose between the family I was born to and the family I am creating?" Dylan leaned forward, engrossed. So Great-Grandpa Howard was married to this Elizabeth woman first, and they were going to have a baby. Jack nodded slowly, his mind racing. "Apparently so, but Dad never mentioned any of this. As far as I knew, Howard married Martha, and they had my father, Frank, in 1937. "What happened to Elizabeth and their baby?" Dylan asked. Jack turned more pages, scanning entries. His expression grew somber as he read ahead. According to these entries, Elizabeth was estranged from her family because they disapproved of her marrying a farmer, but she was set to inherit a substantial estate from her grandfather. Further reading revealed a complex tale of family discord. Elizabeth's father, Richard Sinclair, had apparently been a prominent businessman in Chicago with connections to local politics. He had stringently opposed his daughter's marriage to a country bumpkin and had taken extreme measures to end the relationship. "This is like a soap opera," Dylan commented, examining a photograph of Elizabeth standing proudly in front of the farmhouse, her hand resting protectively over a slightly swollen belly. "There's more," Jack said, his voice tight as he read from a later entry. "November 18, 1928. Richard arrived today with 2 men. They demanded I return to Chicago, saying Mother is gravely ill and asking for me. I do not believe them. Howard was in town delivering our harvest. I am afraid of what Father might do if I refuse again." The next entry was dated 2 weeks later, in a shakier hand. "December 2, 1928. I have escaped from the sanatorium Father placed me in. They said I was hysterical, suffering delusions about a farmer husband. Doctor, Winters even suggested my pregnancy was imagined. I managed to take my wedding certificate and grandfather's deed before they caught me packing. Now I must reach Howard before father realizes I am gone." This was the final entry in the journal. Jack and Dylan looked at each other, the implications settling heavily between them. "Did she make it back?" Dylan asked. Jack shook his head. "I don't know." He reached for the stack of letters, untying the blue ribbon. "Maybe these will tell us more." The letters, it turned out, were written by Howard to Elizabeth over a period of several months in early 1929. They were addressed to Mount Haven Wellness Retreat in northern Wisconsin, and each was marked "Return to Sender, Patient Not Accepting Correspondence." Howard's letters became increasingly desperate, pleading for information about Elizabeth and their child. The final letter, dated June 1929, contained a single line: "I will never stop looking for you and our child." So her father basically had her committed to prevent the marriage? Dylan asked, horrified. Jack nodded grimly. It seems that way. Things like that could happen back then, especially with wealthy, influential families. Women had few legal protections. As they continued sorting through the documents, Jack found a folded newspaper clipping dated September 12, 1929. The headline read, "Sinclair Heiress Dies in Tragic Accident." The brief article stated that Elizabeth Sinclair, daughter of prominent businessman Richard Sinclair, had died when her motorcar veered off a bridge near Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. The article mentioned she had been recuperating at a health retreat following a nervous condition. "She died," Dylan said softly. "What about the baby?" Jack shook his head, continuing to search through the remaining documents. At the very bottom of the chest lay a final envelope, addressed simply to "My husband" in Elizabeth's handwriting. Inside was a letter dated August 30th, 1929, and a small brass key. Jack read the letter aloud, his voice catching, "My dearest Howard, if you are reading this, I fear I may not have reached you in time. I have escaped the sanitarium where father has kept me these 8 months, but I am being followed. Our son was born on May 15th, 1929. They took him from me immediately, telling me he had died, but I heard him cry. I believe father has arranged for his adoption to a suitable family. I have discovered that father intends to destroy any record of our marriage to protect the family name and his political aspirations. The enclosed key opens a safety deposit box at Chicago National Bank, where I have placed copies of our marriage certificate and grandfather's deed, granting me ownership of the logging lands adjoining your farm, my wedding gift to you that I never had the chance to give. I will try to reach you, my love, but if I fail, know that you and our son were the greatest joy of my life. Always yours, Elizabeth." A heavy silence fell over the barn. Jack stared at the letter, then at the key in his palm. "Dad," Dylan said finally, "if Elizabeth and Howard had a son in 1929, that couldn't have been my father," Jack finished. "Frank was born in 1937, 8 years later, to Howard and Martha. So what happened to Elizabeth and Howard's baby? Your father had an older half-brother somewhere?" Jack ran a hand through his hair, overwhelmed by the implications. "I don't know, but apparently Howard kept all this hidden away, the evidence of his first marriage, his first child. And the land," Dylan added, picking up the deed they'd found. "According to this, Elizabeth's grandfather left her the timber property that borders this farm, almost 300 acres. That would make it part of our inheritance, right?" Jack examined the deed more carefully. The description matched the heavily wooded land that extended beyond their eastern property line, land that, as far as he knew, had always belonged to the Wheaton estate, which had been in that family for generations. "This doesn't make sense," Jack muttered. "That land has belonged to the Wheaton family for as long as I can remember." Dylan's eyes widened. "Wheaton? Like that guy who was just here? Douglas Wheaton?" A chill ran down Jack's spine as he connected the dots. The timberlands would be worth millions now. If Elizabeth's family somehow managed to hide the deed and claim the property, then the Wheatons have been on Miller land all this time, Dylan finished. "And Douglas Wheaton showing up right after we got here is probably not a coincidence," Jack agreed. He carefully returned the documents to the chest. "We need to learn more before we jump to conclusions. Let's go see Margaret Wilson. If anyone knows the old history of this place, it's her." On their way out of the barn, Jack paused, looking back at the chest. "Dylan, let's keep this between us for now, okay? At least until we understand what we're dealing with." Dylan nodded, his expression unusually serious. "Okay, Dad, but what about that safety deposit box, the key?" Jack pocketed the small brass key. One step at a time. First, let's talk to Margaret. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications to find out what happens next in this family mystery. What would you do if you discovered your family history wasn't what you thought? Let me know in the comments. Margaret Wilson's house sat across the road, a well-maintained white farmhouse with cheerful blue shutters and a wraparound porch adorned with hanging ferns. As Jack and Dylan approached, she emerged from the front door as if she'd been expecting them. "Well, look who's here," she called, wiping her hands on an apron dusted with flour. "I was just taking an apple pie out of the oven." Perfect timing. Jack smiled, despite the turmoil in his mind. "We don't want to intrude, Margaret." "Nonsense. I've been baking pies for Miller men for 60 years. No reason to stop now." She held the door open. "Come on in." The interior of Margaret's home was cozy and immaculate, with comfortable furniture that had clearly been selected for longevity rather than fashion. Family photographs crowded the walls and shelves, chronicling decades of rural Wisconsin life. As they settled at her kitchen table with generous slices of pie and glasses of cold milk, Margaret studied Jack's face. "You've got something on your mind, Jack Miller. I can see it plain as day. Your father got that same furrow between his eyebrows when something was troubling him." Jack hesitated, unsure how to begin. "Margaret, how long did your family live across from ours?" "The Wilsons have been neighbors to the Millers since 1912, when my grandfather built our place. Why do you ask?" "Did you ever hear anything about my grandfather Howard having been married before he met my grandmother Martha?" Margaret's hand, reaching for her glass of water, froze mid-air. Her eyes darted briefly to Dylan, then back to Jack. "Why would you ask about such a thing?" "We found some documents," Jack said carefully. "Letters, photographs, a journal belonging to someone named Elizabeth Sinclair Miller." Margaret set her glass down slowly, her expression grave. "I was 16 when all that happened. Not supposed to know about it, of course. But in small towns, secrets have a way of traveling." "So it's true? Howard was married before?" Margaret nodded. "To a city girl from a rich family. Very hush-hush at the time. Her father was some big shot in Chicago who didn't approve of his daughter marrying a farmer." She sighed deeply. "It ended badly." "The journal said she was committed to a sanitarium," Dylan interjected, earning a warning look from Jack. If Margaret was surprised by Dylan's knowledge, she didn't show it. That's what people said. Howard was devastated. Searched for her for months. Then word came she'd died in a car accident. Margaret's eyes took on a faraway look. He was never the same after that. Kept to himself mostly, worked the farm from dawn till dusk like a man possessed. "What about their child?" Jack asked. "Elizabeth's letter mentioned a son born in May 1929. Margaret's eyebrows shot up. "A letter? You found a letter from Elizabeth?" Jack nodded. "It said she'd had a baby boy that her father took away." "Did you ever hear anything about that?" Margaret was silent for a long moment, absently tracing the pattern on her tablecloth with a weathered finger. "There were rumors," she said finally. "Nothing certain. Howard never spoke of it, at least not publicly. 8 years later, he married Martha Johnson from 2 counties over, and they had your father in 37. But the baby, Elizabeth's baby, what happened to him?" Dylan pressed. "If there was a child, the Sinclairs would have arranged a private adoption, I expect. Rich families had ways of handling such matters discreetly." Margaret's gaze sharpened. "What else did you find, Jack?" Jack described the chest's contents, including the deed to the timberlands and the safety deposit box key. As he spoke, Margaret's expression grew increasingly troubled. "The Wheaton property," she murmured when he finished. "I always wondered why Howard never contested it." "What do you mean?" "That land was always understood to be part of the Miller holdings, until suddenly it wasn't. Sometime in the early 30s, it became Wheaton land. No one questioned it much. The Depression had hit, and folks had bigger worries." She paused. "Though now that I think of it, Richard Sinclair and Joseph Wheaton, that would be Douglas's grandfather, were known to be business associates." Jack's mind raced with implications. So the Wheatons might have acquired the land through Richard Sinclair, land that actually belonged to Elizabeth and should have passed to her child. "Or to Howard as her husband," Margaret agreed, "assuming they could prove the marriage was legal, which, from what you found, it seems it was. That's why Wheaton is so interested in our property," Dylan said excitedly. "He must know about this." Margaret reached across the table and gripped Jack's hand with surprising strength. "Be careful, Jack. Douglas Wheaton has a lot of influence in this county now. His development company employs half the town, and he's got the county commissioners in his pocket. You think he knows about all this? Jack asked. I think 3 generations of Wheatons have benefited from that land. Douglas more than most. He's the one who started logging it aggressively and developing portions for vacation homes. Her eyes narrowed. And I think it's mighty convenient that he showed up at your door the very day you returned. On the walk back to their farmhouse, Dylan was buzzing with excitement. This is like a real-life mystery, Dad. The Wheatons basically stole your family's land. We don't know that for certain, Jack cautioned, though the evidence was compelling. And even if the land was rightfully Elizabeth's, proving it legally after all this time would be challenging. But we have the deed and the marriage certificate, and the key to the safety deposit box might have even more proof. Jack nodded thoughtfully. Maybe. We'll need to check if that bank still exists, or what happened to its accounts. He glanced at his son, feeling a surge of pride at the boy's sharp mind. You're really into this, aren't you? Dylan shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant, though his eyes shone with enthusiasm. It's our family history. And it's kind of cool, like we're detectives. As they approached their driveway, Jack noticed a sheriff's department SUV parked beside the house. A deputy, young with close-cropped hair and mirrored sunglasses, leaned against the vehicle. Afternoon, the deputy called as they approached. You must be Jack Miller. That's right. Can I help you, deputy? Wheaton. Eric Wheaton. The deputy removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were startlingly similar to Douglas Wheaton's. Douglas Wheaton is my uncle. He mentioned he stopped by earlier. Jack felt Dylan tense beside him. That's right. He expressed interest in the property. Deputy Wheaton nodded. Uncle Doug's been expanding his developments. Your land would connect his existing properties. He glanced toward the barn. Just stopping by to introduce myself, being neighborly. Small towns, you know how it is. Everyone knows everyone's business. I remember, Jack said neutrally. Heard you might be fixing up to sell. The deputy's gaze was assessing. Finding everything you expected in the old place? Jack maintained a casual expression. More or less. Lot of memories here. I bet. Deputy Wheaton replaced his sunglasses. Well, if you need anything, the sheriff's department is here to help. We take care of our own in Oakfield. As the deputy drove away, Dylan whispered, He knows, Dad. They know we found something. Jack put an arm around his son's shoulders. Maybe. Or maybe we're getting paranoid. But as they walked toward the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That evening, after dinner, Jack called an old college friend who had become a real estate attorney in Minneapolis. Without revealing all the details, he described the situation hypothetically and asked about the legal implications of finding a potentially valid deed to property that had been in another family's possession for generations. Adverse possession laws could come into play, his friend explained. In Wisconsin, if someone has been openly occupying and using land for at least 20 years, they can claim legal ownership, even against the actual deed holder. What if the original deed holder never contested it because they didn't know about the deed? That could complicate things, especially if there's evidence of concealment or fraud. How old are these documents? About 95 years. A low whistle came through the phone. That's going to be tricky, Jack. You'd need solid documentation and a good lawyer, and even then, courts tend to favor the status quo with properties that have been in a family's possession that long. After hanging up, Jack found Dylan in the living room scrolling through his phone. I've got internet, the boy announced triumphantly. Weak signal, but it works. Great, Jack said, dropping onto the couch beside him. Any luck with your research? Dylan had taken it upon himself to search for information about the Chicago Sinclair family and Mount Haven Wellness Retreat. Some? The Sinclairs were really rich, banking and real estate. Richard Sinclair was actually considered for a cabinet position in the Hoover administration, but withdrew his name. Interesting. What about the sanitarium? Mount Haven closed in the 1950s. There's not much online about it, but I found an old newspaper article that called it a discreet establishment catering to the emotional disturbances of society's elite. Dylan made a face, which basically means they locked up inconvenient relatives. Jack nodded grimly. And the Chicago National Bank? Merged with First Illinois in 1943, which was later acquired by Midwest Financial in 1978, which became part of National United Banks in the 90s. Dylan looked up from his phone. There's a National United branch in Milwaukee. Jack fingered the small brass key in his pocket. Guess we're taking a road trip to Milwaukee tomorrow." Later that night, as Dylan slept upstairs, Jack sat on the porch with his father's journal, a leather-bound volume he'd found in Frank's desk. Unlike Elizabeth's eloquent prose, Frank's entries were sparse and practical, mostly concerning farm operations and weather conditions. But scattered throughout were personal observations that revealed a complex man Jack had never fully understood. One entry, dated June 15th, 1972, the day after Jack's high school graduation, caught his attention. Jack announced he's going to college for architecture. Says he won't be coming back to the farm. Can't say I blame him. This land has taken more than it's given. Some legacies are better left buried. Still, I had hoped. The entry ended there, the thought unfinished. Jack closed the journal, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. What had his father meant? What legacies were better left buried? As he gazed out at the starlit fields of the farm, Jack couldn't help but feel that he'd stumbled into something larger and more complex than a simple property dispute. Whatever secrets the Miller farm held, they had shaped his family for generations, and now they would shape his son's future as well. Enjoying the mystery unfolding? Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. What do you think is in that safety deposit box? Drop your predictions in the comments. The Milwaukee skyline appeared on the horizon as Jack and Dylan finished their breakfast sandwiches from a drive-thru. They had left Oakfield before dawn, the chest of documents securely locked in the trunk of Jack's pickup. "What if the box is empty?" Dylan asked, voicing the concern that had been nagging at Jack. "Then we'll have taken a nice father-son road trip," Jack replied, keeping his tone light despite his own apprehension. "But I don't think it will be empty." Elizabeth went to great lengths to preserve these documents. The National United Bank downtown branch occupied the first floor of a gleaming glass tower. As they walked through the revolving door into the marble-floored lobby, Jack felt distinctly underdressed in his jeans and flannel shirt. At the information desk, a professionally attired young woman directed them to the bank manager's office. After Jack explained they needed assistance with a potential historical safety deposit box. Theodore Grayson, the bank manager, was a distinguished man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and rimless glasses. He listened attentively as Jack explained their situation, careful to include only the necessary details. "So you believe your grandfather's first wife may have opened a safety deposit box here in 1929, when this was Chicago National Bank?" Grayson clarified, examining the small brass key Jack had placed on his desk. "Yes, we have a letter indicating she deposited important family documents here." Grayson's expression was professionally neutral. "Mr. Miller, I should inform you that banks typically drill and empty unclaimed safety deposit boxes after a certain period of abandonment. The contents are usually auctioned or remitted to the state as unclaimed property." Jack's heart sank. "So after 96 years. However," Grayson continued, "Chicago National was known for its exceptionally accommodating policies for wealthy clients. Some boxes were prepaid for extended periods." He picked up the key, examining its antique design. "This is certainly consistent with keys from that era. Let me consult our historical records." While Grayson tapped at his computer, Dylan whispered to Jack, "If the box is gone, could we trace what happened to the contents?" Jack shrugged slightly. "Maybe, but it would be complicated after all this time." "Actually," Grayson said, looking up with evident surprise, "we do have record of a safety deposit box registered to an E.S. Miller from 1929. It's listed as a perpetual account, which was a service offered to certain clients who paid a substantial one-time fee." Jack straightened in his chair. "And it's still here, intact?" "According to our records, yes, it was transferred through each bank merger." Grayson removed his glasses. "However, Mr. Miller, accessing a safety deposit box after this length of time presents certain challenges. We'll need to verify your claim to the contents." Over the next hour, Jack presented their documentation, the marriage certificate, Elizabeth's letter mentioning the safety deposit box, and Howard's birth certificate showing he was Jack's grandfather. After consulting with the bank's legal department by phone, Grayson finally nodded. "This appears to establish a legitimate chain of inheritance. As Elizabeth Miller's grandson-in-law, you would have a claim to access the box." He paused. "I should note that we'll need to document this access carefully, as there could be other potential claimants to whatever contents remain." Jack nodded, understanding the implication. If Elizabeth had indeed had a child who was adopted by another family, That child or their descendants might have a competing claim. Grayson led them to the safety deposit vault, a windowless room lined with metal boxes of varying sizes. Using an electronic keypad, he entered a code that unlocked a section of larger, older-looking boxes. "Box 1038, Grayson announced, pointing to a brass-numbered drawer. "Your key should open it, Mr. Miller." With slightly trembling fingers, Jack inserted the small brass key. It turned smoothly as if it had been waiting all these decades for this moment. Together with Grayson's master key, the box unlocked with a solid click. Grayson pulled the long metal drawer out and placed it on a private viewing table. "I'll give you privacy to examine the contents. Please document anything you remove on this form." He handed Jack a clipboard and stepped outside. Jack and Dylan leaned forward as Jack lifted the lid. Inside lay several items: a thick envelope sealed with wax, a small jewelry box, a folded American flag, and what appeared to be a child's well-worn teddy bear. "A teddy bear?" Dylan whispered, touching it gently. Jack lifted the envelope first. The wax seal bore the impression of a signet ring with an ornate S, presumably for Sinclair. Breaking it carefully, Jack removed several documents. The first was a notarized copy of the marriage certificate they had already found. The second was a deed to the timber property, identical to the one in the chest. But the third document made Jack's breath catch: a birth certificate for James Howard Miller, born May 15, 1929, to Elizabeth Sinclair Miller and Howard James Miller. "This proves it," Jack said quietly. "They did have a son." Dylan picked up the teddy bear, examining the worn fabric and missing eye. "She must have left this for him. His first toy." Jack nodded, a lump forming in his throat as he imagined Elizabeth carefully placing her baby's toy in this box, hoping somehow it would reach him someday. The jewelry box contained a man's signet ring with the Sinclair family crest and a handwritten note. "Howard, this was my grandfather's. He would have wanted our son to have it one day." And the final item in the envelope was the most significant: a copy of Elizabeth Sinclair's grandfather's will, leaving the timber property explicitly to "my beloved granddaughter Elizabeth and her heirs in perpetuity." A handwritten letter from an attorney was attached, stating that the will had been properly executed and filed with the courts. "Dad, this is it," Dylan said excitedly. "Proof that the land legally belonged to Elizabeth and should have passed to her son, your uncle." Jack examined the documents carefully. "Yes, but it also confirms that we don't know what happened to James Howard Miller. If he survived and was adopted, he or his descendants would be the rightful heirs, not us." "But we're related," Dylan argued, "and we're the ones who found all this." "That's not how inheritance works, Dylan." Jack gathered the documents carefully. "We need to find out what happened to Elizabeth and Howard's son. That's the missing piece." After completing the required forms and having copies made of all documents, Jack and Dylan left the bank with their discoveries. The original documents would remain secure in the safety deposit box until they determined their next steps. As they walked to their truck, Jack noticed a black SUV similar to the one he'd seen driving past the farm, idling across the street. When the driver saw Jack looking, the vehicle pulled away quickly. "Dad?" Dylan questioned, noting Jack's distraction. "It's nothing," Jack said, not wanting to worry his son. "Let's get some lunch before we head back." Over burgers at a downtown diner, they discussed their findings. "So what do we do now?" Dylan asked. "Try to find out what happened to James." Jack nodded. "That seems like the logical next step. If we can trace what happened to him after Elizabeth died, we might be able to determine if he has living descendants. And if we can't find him or any descendants, then the inheritance would likely pass through Howard to my father, and then to me." Jack took a thoughtful sip of his coffee. "But even with these documents, challenging the Wheaton family's claim to land they've held for nearly a century would be difficult. We'd need solid evidence of fraud or deliberate concealment. Like if Richard Sinclair and Joseph Wheaton conspired to hide Elizabeth's marriage and her baby's existence so the Wheatons could get the land," Dylan suggested. Jack smiled slightly at his son's quick understanding. "Exactly. But proving that after all this time." They spent the drive back to Oakfield brainstorming ways to trace James Howard Miller's fate. Dylan suggested searching adoption records, but Jack explained that private adoptions in the 1920s, especially those arranged by wealthy families, were often conducted with minimal documentation, specifically to prevent the kind of tracing they were attempting. "What about DNA testing?" Dylan proposed. "Like those ancestry websites? If James had descendants, they might have done DNA tests. Jack considered this. That's actually not a bad idea. We could submit our DNA and see if we get matches that don't fit our known family tree. When they returned to the farm, Jack was immediately aware something was wrong. The front door, which he distinctly remembered locking, stood slightly ajar. "Stay in the truck," he told Dylan sharply. "Dad, what?" "Just stay here." Jack approached the house cautiously, pushing the door open wider. Inside, the living room had been thoroughly searched. Drawers pulled out, cushions removed from furniture, books pulled from shelves. Jack's heart raced as he moved through the house. The kitchen and bedrooms had received similar treatment. When he reached his father's study, he found the desk drawers emptied onto the floor, papers scattered everywhere. After confirming the intruders were gone, Jack called Dylan in and then phoned the sheriff's department. To his dismay, it was Deputy Eric Wheaton who responded to the call. "Looks like a standard break-in," the deputy said, surveying the mess with professional detachment. "Anything valuable missing?" Jack had already checked. "Not that I can tell. My laptop is still here, so are our phones and wallets. Probably kids looking for cash or prescription drugs," Wheaton suggested. "We've had a few break-ins around the county lately." "The doors weren't forced," Jack pointed out. "Someone either had a key or knew how to pick locks." Deputy Wheaton shrugged. "Old farmhouses like this, locks aren't exactly high security." He made a show of taking notes in his pad. "I'll file a report. Not much else we can do without evidence or witnesses." After the deputy left, Dylan helped Jack restore order to the house. "They were looking for the chest," Dylan said quietly, as they reorganized the study. Jack nodded. "I think so too. Good thing we took it with us." "It had to be the Wheatons, right? They must know about the documents." "We don't have proof of that," Jack cautioned, though he privately agreed. "But it does suggest we're on to something significant." That evening, as darkness fell over the farm, Jack sat on the porch watching the road. The break-in had left him uneasy, aware that their investigation had stirred up long-buried secrets that someone clearly wanted to remain hidden. His phone rang. Margaret Wilson. "Jack, I just heard about the break-in. Are you and Dylan all right?" "We're fine, Margaret. Nothing was taken." "That's not a regular burglary, Jack. That's someone sending a message." Her voice lowered. "I've been thinking about what you found. There's someone you should talk to, Harriet Jenkins. She's in the Oakfield Care Center now, but her mind is still sharp as a tack. She worked as a nurse at Mount Haven in the late 20s. If anyone might know what happened to Elizabeth after the baby was born, it would be Harriet." Jack straightened. "She's still alive. She'd have to be 97 next month," Margaret confirmed. "Like I said, sharp as a tack, remembers everything. I called ahead. She's expecting you tomorrow morning." After thanking Margaret, Jack found Dylan in the kitchen making sandwiches for dinner. "We've got a lead," he told his son, explaining about Harriet Jenkins. Dylan's eyes lit up. "A real witness. This is getting more interesting by the minute." Jack smiled at his son's enthusiasm, but couldn't shake his growing concern. "Dylan, I think we need to be more careful. That break-in was targeted. Someone knows what we've found and doesn't want us digging deeper. You think we're in danger?" For the first time, Dylan looked uncertain. Jack put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I don't think anyone would hurt us. But there's a lot at stake here. Potentially valuable property, family reputations, maybe even legal consequences if there was fraud involved. We're not giving up though, right?" Dylan asked. Jack thought about the teddy bear in the safety deposit box, a mother's token of love for a child she'd been forced to abandon. "No, we're not giving up. Elizabeth and Howard's son deserves to have his story told, whatever it is. And if there are descendants out there who don't know their true heritage, they deserve to know that too." Later, after Dylan had gone to bed, Jack retrieved Frank's journal and began reading more carefully. If his father had known anything about Howard's first marriage and child, perhaps he had recorded it somewhere. Most entries remained focused on farm operations, but occasionally Frank wrote about personal matters: Jack's mother, village gossip, his hopes for Jack's future. Then, in an entry from 1970, Jack found something intriguing. Wheaton came by again about selling the east property line, says the original survey was wrong, that their deed shows they own another 20 acres of what I've always thought was Miller land. Showed me some old documents I can't make heads or tails of. When I mentioned the locked chest Howard kept in the hidden storage room, Wheaton got real interested. Said his father and Howard had an understanding about family matters better left in the past. Don't know what that means, but I don't like it. Told him the chest was lost in the barn fire of 52. That seemed to satisfy him. Jack reread the entry several times. The barn had indeed burned in 1952 and been rebuilt, but obviously the chest hadn't been lost, and Frank had known about it all along, but had chosen to hide its existence from the Wheatons. Turning to later entries, Jack found scattered references to Wheaton's claim, but nothing definitive, until an entry from 1991. Doug Wheaton, Joseph's grandson, graduated law school, coming back to join the family business. Old Joseph told me once that blood always returns to claim what's his. Thought he meant the land dispute, but now I wonder. Jack hasn't been home in 15 years. Maybe some secrets should stay buried after all. Jack closed the journal, his mind racing. The cryptic entries suggested Frank had known something about the Wheaton connection, but had deliberately kept Jack in the dark. Was it to protect him? Or was there something more sinister at work? Tomorrow, Jack resolved, they would visit Harriet Jenkins and hopefully learn more about Elizabeth's fate and that of her son. But tonight, he double-checked every lock and kept the chest of documents close at hand, unable to shake the feeling that the past was rapidly catching up to the present, and that not everyone would welcome the truth it contained. If you're enjoying this family mystery, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Who do you think broke into the farmhouse? Share your theories in the comments below. The Oakfield Care Center stood on the outskirts of town, a single-story brick building surrounded by well-tended gardens. Despite the cheerful mums flanking the entrance, Jack felt a sense of unease as they approached. Places like this always reminded him of the sanitarium that had held Elizabeth against her will. "Are you sure she's going to remember stuff from 90-some years ago?" Dylan asked, as they signed in at the reception desk. "Margaret says she's remarkably sharp," Jack replied, "and sometimes people remember their young adult years more clearly than recent events." A cheerful aide led them to a sunroom at the back of the facility, where an elderly woman sat in a wheelchair near the windows. Despite her advanced age, Harriet Jenkins maintained an air of dignity, her white hair neatly styled, a crocheted shawl draped over her shoulders. "Mrs. Jenkins, I'm Jack Miller, and this is my son Dylan. Margaret Wilson told you we might be stopping by." Harriet's faded blue eyes sparkled with interest. "The Miller boy." "Yes," Margaret called. "Said you're asking questions about Mount Haven and the Sinclair girl." Her voice was surprisingly strong for someone her age. "Didn't think anyone remembered that business anymore." Jack took a seat beside her. "We found some documents that belonged to Elizabeth Sinclair Miller. I believe she was my grandfather Howard's first wife." Harriet nodded slowly. "So the truth comes out at last. I always wondered if it would." She gestured to a chair. "Sit, young man. This is a long story." As Dylan settled into a chair across from them, Harriet's gaze focused on something distant, something nearly a century in the past. "I was just 20 when I started nursing at Mount Haven. It was 1929, the stock market hadn't crashed yet, and wealthy families paid good money to keep their inconvenient relatives out of sight." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "We called it a wellness retreat, but it was really a private asylum where the rich could hide away family members who embarrassed them. Unmarried pregnant daughters, alcoholic sons, wives who weren't properly obedient." Jack felt a chill at her matter-of-fact description. "Elizabeth Sinclair arrived in December 1928, Harriet continued. "Beautiful girl, maybe 19 or 20. They said she was suffering from delusions about being married to a farmer. Her father was some big shot from Chicago. Came with the doctors when they admitted her." She shook her head. "I knew right away she wasn't crazy. Desperate, yes. Frightened, certainly. But not delusional." "She was pregnant," Jack prompted gently. "About 4 months along when she arrived. They kept her heavily sedated at first. When she was lucid, she would beg to contact her husband, wrote letters every day until they took her paper away." Harriet's eyes clouded with old anger. "I helped her sometimes, smuggled a few letters out. Never knew if they reached him." "They didn't," Jack said quietly. "We found Howard's letters to her, all marked, 'Return to sender.'" Harriet nodded grimly. "Figured as much. Her father had arranged for all her mail to be intercepted." "What happened when the baby was born?" Dylan asked, leaning forward intently. "May 15th, 1929. Difficult birth. Elizabeth was weak from months of confinement and poor treatment, but she delivered a healthy baby boy." Harriet's voice softened with the memory. "She named him James Howard Miller. I let her hold him for a few minutes before they took him away. Told her he'd died, but I made sure she knew that was a lie." A tear slid down her weathered cheek. The way she looked at that child in those brief moments, such love. "Do you know what happened to the baby?" Jack asked, his throat tight with emotion. Harriet nodded. Richard Sinclair had arranged a private adoption before the birth, a childless couple from one of Chicago's best families. "I wasn't supposed to know, but I overheard the doctors talking." She paused. The adopting father's name was Joseph Wheaton. Jack and Dylan exchanged shocked glances. "Wheaton? Are you certain?" "Absolutely. I remember because Mr. Wheaton came to the sanitarium the day after the birth to complete the paperwork. Tall man, very authoritative. He had timber interests in Wisconsin, they said, and was a business associate of Richard Sinclair." Harriet's eyes narrowed. "The adoption was handled very discreetly, no official records that could be traced. The Wheatons took the baby back to their estate near Oakfield." "So James Howard Miller became a Wheaton," Jack said, piecing it together. "Joseph Wheaton's son." "Adopted son," Harriet corrected, "though I doubt they ever told him that. Those types of families rarely did." "What happened to Elizabeth after the birth?" Dylan asked. Harriet's expression darkened. "They kept her sedated, told her the baby had died. She fell into a deep depression. After about 3 months, Richard Sinclair arranged for her transfer to a facility in Lake Geneva for recuperation. 2 weeks later, we got word she'd died in an automobile accident." The old nurse's voice dropped to a whisper. "I never believed it was an accident. She was too determined to escape to find her husband and child." Jack thought of the newspaper clipping they'd found. The death was reported in the papers. Of course it was. The official story had to be maintained. Harriet reached for Jack's hand, her fingers surprisingly strong. "I've carried this secret for a lifetime, young man. Elizabeth made me promise that if I ever had the chance, I would try to let her husband or child know the truth." "And the child, James, he would have been raised as," Jack began. "As Joseph Wheaton's son," Harriet confirmed, "which would make him Douglas Wheaton's father," Dylan finished. "So Douglas Wheaton is actually Elizabeth and Howard's grandson, our cousin?" Harriet nodded. "If your grandfather was Howard Miller, then yes, Douglas Wheaton would be your father's first cousin, though I doubt he knows it. Or maybe he does," Jack said thoughtfully. "It would explain why the Wheatons have been so interested in our property over the years." As they prepared to leave, Harriet called Jack back. "There's one more thing you should know. Elizabeth managed to smuggle some items out of Mount Haven. Documents, I believe, and personal effects. She gave them to me for safekeeping, asking me to get them to Howard if I could." "The safety deposit box," Jack murmured. Harriet looked surprised. "Yes, she gave me a key and instructions. I was young and frightened of losing my position, so I waited until my day off to go to Chicago. By the time I worked up the courage to try contacting Howard Miller, word came that Elizabeth had died." She sighed heavily. "I should have tried anyway. That's been my greatest regret." "You did what you could in a difficult situation," Jack reassured her, "and the box remained safe all these years. We found it." Harriet's eyes brightened. "You did? What was in it?" Jack described the contents, including the teddy bear. Tears welled in Harriet's eyes. "I remember that bear. Elizabeth kept it under her pillow. She wanted her son to have something from her, even if she couldn't be with him." As they drove away from the care center, Dylan was buzzing with excitement. "This is incredible, Dad. Douglas Wheaton is actually James Howard Miller. He's our cousin." "Not Douglas," Jack corrected. "Douglas would be James's son. James himself would be in his 90s now if he's still alive. Still, the Wheatons are actually Millers by blood, and they've been sitting on land that should have been part of our inheritance all along." Jack frowned, navigating the rural roads back toward the farm. "It's more complicated than that, Dylan. The Wheatons didn't know they were related to us. At least James wouldn't have if the adoption was kept secret, as was common then. And the land issue. But if we can prove the connection, and prove that the land was wrongfully taken—" "Even if we could," Jack interrupted, "what would be the point? To take land and wealth from people who've considered it theirs for generations, to disrupt lives with revelations about parentage that might not be welcome." Dylan stared at him. "Don't you care about justice, about what's rightfully ours?" "Of course I do. But justice isn't always straightforward, especially when it involves secrets nearly a century old." Jack sighed. "We need to think carefully about what to do with this information." As they approached the farm, Jack noticed a sleek black car parked in their driveway, Douglas Wheaton's Mercedes. The man himself stood on their porch, checking his watch impatiently. "Perfect timing," Wheaton called as they parked. I was about to leave. Jack stepped out of the truck, instinctively placing himself between Wheaton and Dillon. "Mr. Wheaton, this is a surprise. I heard about the break-in. Small towns, news travels fast." Wheaton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Wanted to make sure you were all right. Nothing valuable taken, I hope?" "We're fine, thank you, and no, nothing important was taken." Wheaton nodded, his gaze drifting toward their truck, where the chest of documents was securely locked in the toolbox. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding your property. I'd like to make a formal offer, well above market value." Jack studied the man before him, seeing him in a new light. The shape of his jaw, the set of his eyes, were there echoes of Howard Miller there passed down through generations? "That's very generous," Jack said carefully, "but we're still sorting through my father's affairs. Not ready to make decisions yet." "Of course." Wheaton's tone was pleasant, but his expression hardened slightly. "Just don't wait too long. Opportunities like this don't come around every day." "Why the rush, Mr. Wheaton? The property isn't going anywhere." Wheaton adjusted his expensive watch. "Development plans, timelines to meet, business considerations." He paused. "I understand you've been asking questions around town, about old history, family matters. Just trying to understand my roots. Is that a problem?" "Not at all. But sometimes digging up the past can be messy. Not everything buried deserves to be unearthed." Wheaton stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Your father understood that. Frank was a practical man who knew when to let sleeping dogs lie." The implicit threat wasn't lost on Jack. "I'm not my father." "Clearly not." Wheaton handed him a business card. "My offer stands until the end of the week. After that, well, circumstances change." As Wheaton drove away, Dillon joined his father on the porch. "He's threatening us," the boy said quietly. "He's trying to intimidate us," Jack corrected. "There's a difference. What are we going to do now?" Jack watched the dust settle on the driveway. "We're going to visit the county records office. If Elizabeth's grandfather's will was properly filed, there should be public records of the timberland's ownership history. We need to understand exactly how the property transferred from the Sinclairs to the Wheatons." That afternoon, they drove to the county seat, where the records office occupied the basement of the courthouse. The clerk, an older woman with cat-eye glasses and a suspicious nature, initially balked at their request to see historical property records. "Those old deed books are in storage," she said. "Would take days to locate them." Jack leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Actually, we're researching a historical novel about the area, featuring some of the prominent local families, the Wheatons, for instance." At the mention of the Wheaton name, the clerk's demeanor shifted subtly. "The Wheatons? Well, that's different. They're practically county royalty." She disappeared into a back room, returning several minutes later with a large leather-bound volume. "This has the land transactions from 1920 to 1940. Sign here, and you can use the research table over there." The deed book was massive, its pages yellowed with age. Jack and Dillon carefully turned the brittle pages, scanning for transactions involving the timber property. "Here," Dillon said suddenly, pointing to an entry from March 1930. "Transfer of deed for the property described as timberlands adjoining Miller Farm, 280 acres, from Sinclair Holdings to Wheaton Lumber Company for the sum of $1. $1? Jack frowned. "That's a nominal amount, used when property is transferred without an actual sale, like between family members. Or when the transfer isn't legitimate," Dillon suggested. Jack found the entry for the original ownership, a record showing the property had been granted to Elizabeth C. Sinclair, heir of Clarence Sinclair, in 1927. Then, after her reported death, the land had transferred to Sinclair Holdings, a company owned by Richard Sinclair, before being conveyed to Wheaton Lumber. So Richard Sinclair took control of the property after Elizabeth's death, then transferred it to the Wheatons, Jack summarized, probably part of the arrangement involving James's adoption. "But if Elizabeth was married to Howard, and they had a child, shouldn't the property have passed to them?" Dillon asked. "Only if the marriage was legally recognized. From what we've found, Richard Sinclair went to great lengths to erase any record of that marriage." They continued searching, finding additional transactions over the decades as portions of the timberland were developed or sold. By the 1990s, the property had been divided into luxury home sites, a golf course, and a nature preserve, all controlled by Wheaton Development Corporation, with Douglas Wheaton listed as president. "The land is worth millions now," Dylan whispered. No wonder he's so desperate to keep this quiet. As they were preparing to leave, Jack noticed a reference to another record book, one containing court cases from the same period. On a hunch, he requested it from the increasingly cooperative clerk. In the court records, they found an entry from April 1929. In re estate of Clarence Sinclair, petition by Howard J. Miller for recognition of wife's inheritance rights. The case had been dismissed when the petitioner failed to appear at the scheduled hearing. Howard tried to claim Elizabeth's inheritance through the courts, Jack realized, but something prevented him from attending the hearing. A notation in the margin, handwritten in fading ink, provided a clue. Petitioner withdrawn by letter, no longer pursuing claim. Why would Howard give up? Dylan wondered. That doesn't make sense with everything else we know. Jack frowned thoughtfully. Unless he was coerced, or unless he was offered something he valued more. Like what? Information about his son, perhaps. Jack closed the book carefully. We need to look at this from all angles, Dylan. Howard eventually married Martha and had my father. He rebuilt his life. Maybe at some point, he made peace with losing Elizabeth and their child. Dylan shook his head stubbornly, but he kept the chest hidden all those years. He preserved the evidence. He wanted the truth to be known eventually. You're right, Jack acknowledged. And now we have to decide what to do with that truth. Driving back to the farm, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Twice he noticed a vehicle following them at a distance, though it turned off before he could confirm his suspicions. Dad, Dylan said as they neared home, what if Douglas Wheaton really doesn't know he's actually a miller? Doesn't he deserve to know the truth about his family? Jack glanced at his son, struck by the maturity of the question. That's a complex ethical issue, Dylan. Some people might prefer not to have their understanding of their identity disrupted. But if it were me, I'd want to know, Dylan insisted. Even if it was complicated or painful, I'd want the truth. Jack nodded slowly. I think I would too. As the familiar shape of the Miller farmhouse came into view, Jack made a decision. Tomorrow we'll talk to Douglas Wheaton. Directly, honestly. Show him what we've found, and let him decide what happens next. What if he threatens us again? Then at least we'll know we tried to do the right thing. Jack smiled at his son. Sometimes that's all we can do. Are you enjoying this family mystery? Hit subscribe and turn on notifications to see how this confrontation unfolds. Do you think Douglas Wheaton already knows the truth about his heritage? Share your theories in the comments. The Wheaton estate occupied a commanding position on a wooded hillside overlooking the valley. As Jack drove through the ornate iron gates, he couldn't help noticing the property marker. Established 1930, the year after Elizabeth's death and James's adoption. Nervous? He asked Dylan, who sat beside him clutching the folder of documents they had carefully selected to share. A little, the boy admitted. What if he already knows and has been hiding it? Then we'll find out why. Just follow my lead and remember, we're not here to make accusations. We're sharing information that affects both our families. The main house was an impressive Tudor-style mansion that had clearly been expanded over the decades. A housekeeper answered their ring, her surprise evident when Jack requested to speak with Mr. Wheaton. Do you have an appointment? She asked skeptically, taking in their casual attire. No, but it's a family matter, Jack replied. Please tell him Jack and Dylan Miller are here. They were shown to a wood-paneled study that screamed old money, leather-bound books lining the walls, hunting trophies mounted above a massive stone fireplace, oil paintings of stern-looking men who presumably represented generations of Wheatons. Douglas Wheaton entered a few minutes later, his surprise at their visit barely concealed beneath a veneer of politeness. The Millers. To what do I owe this unexpected visit? Jack stepped forward. Mr. Wheaton, we've discovered some information that concerns both our families. We thought you should know about it directly from us. Wheaton's expression remained neutral, but Jack noticed his posture stiffen slightly. Indeed. And what might that be? It's about your grandfather, James Wheaton, Jack began, and his true parentage. A flicker of something, alarm, recognition, crossed Wheaton's face before his features settled into practiced indifference. My grandfather has been dead for 15 years, Mr. Miller. What possible relevance could his parentage have now? Rather than answering directly, Jack nodded to Dylan, who opened the folder and removed the birth certificate for James Howard Miller. This is a birth certificate for a baby born on May 15, 1929, to Elizabeth Sinclair Miller and Howard Miller. Wheaton barely glanced at it. And According to our research, this child was adopted by Joseph and Eleanor Wheaton shortly after birth. They named him James Wheaton. Jack paused. He was your father's father. Wheaton's laugh held no humor. That's quite a story, Mr. Miller. I assume you have evidence for these creative genealogical theories. Jack outlined what they had discovered. Elizabeth's journal, the documents from the safety deposit box, Harriet Jenkins's testimony, and the county records showing the suspicious transfer of the timber property. As he spoke, Wheaton's expression remained impassive, but Jack noticed his hands gripping the edge of his desk with increasing pressure. I see, Wheaton said when Jack finished. And you've come here because we thought you should know the truth, that our families are connected, that your grandfather was born a miller. Wheaton stood abruptly. Mr. Miller, I appreciate your concern for historical accuracy, but these allegations about my family are not only unsubstantiated but potentially defamatory. They're not allegations, Dillon interjected, his voice cracking slightly with nervousness. We have documents. Ancient papers and the ramblings of a senile nursing home resident hardly constitute proof, Wheaton cut in sharply. And even if this fantastic tale were true, what exactly do you hope to accomplish by dredging it up now? Jack met Wheaton's hostile gaze steadily. We're not looking for anything, Mr. Wheaton. We simply thought you deserved to know your true heritage. My true heritage? Wheaton's voice dripped with scorn. The Wheaton family has been prominent in this county for generations. We've provided jobs, funded public works, preserved natural resources. That is my heritage, Mr. Miller, not some convenient story you've concocted about foundling children and secret marriages. It's not a story, Dillon protested. Elizabeth was forced into a sanitarium because she married a farmer instead of someone from her social class. Her father took her baby away and gave him to the Wheatons. It's all documented. Wheaton's gaze shifted to Dillon, his expression softening slightly. Young man, history is rarely as clear-cut as we'd like it to be. Documents can be forged, memories can be faulty, and the past is often better left undisturbed. He turned back to Jack. I assume you have some purpose beyond a friendly genealogy lesson. Is this about my offer for your property? Are you suggesting some sort of claim on Wheaton lands based on these dubious findings? No, Jack said firmly. We're not here to make claims or demands. We simply thought you should know the truth. The truth. Wheaton spat the word like it tasted bitter. Let me share some truth with you, Mr. Miller. My grandfather, James Wheaton, was a pillar of this community. My father expanded our holdings through honest business practices and hard work. I've continued that legacy. Whatever papers you've found, whatever stories you've heard, they change nothing about who the Wheatons are. But they might change how you see yourself, Jack suggested quietly. Knowing you're descended from Howard Miller, a man who worked the land with his own hands, who loved so deeply he spent years searching for his lost wife and child. Enough! Wheaton slammed his hand on the desk. I won't stand here and listen to this fiction about my family. He took a deep breath, visibly composing himself. I think it's time for you to leave. Jack gathered their documents. We've made copies of everything. If you change your mind, if you want to know more about your Miller ancestors, we're happy to share what we've found. As they turned to go, Wheaton called after them. Miller, you said you're not making any claims, that you just wanted me to know the truth. I find that hard to believe. What is it you really want? Jack paused at the door. Initially, we came to Oakfield just to sell the farm and move on. Now, I'm not so sure. Finding out about Elizabeth and Howard's story, about the child they lost, it's made me reconsider a lot of things. Such as what it means to be connected to a place, to a history. My son is the 6th generation of Millers to set foot on that farm. That means something. A shadow crossed Wheaton's face. Are you saying you've decided not to sell? I'm saying we're reconsidering our options. Wheaton's tone hardened. That would be unwise, Miller, very unwise indeed. Outside, as they walked to their truck, Dillon whispered, He totally knew, Dad. Did you see his face when you mentioned the birth certificate? Jack nodded. I think so too. The question is, how long has he known? And what is he willing to do to keep it quiet? As they drove down the winding driveway, Jack noticed Douglas Wheaton watching them from a window, his expression unreadable behind the reflection on the glass. Back at the farmhouse, they found Margaret Wilson waiting on their porch, her face tight with concern. Jack, where have you been? I've been calling your cell phone. We went to see Douglas Wheaton, Jack explained, checking his phone to find 3 missed calls. "What's wrong, Margaret?" "It's Harriet Jenkins. The care center called me an hour ago. She had a stroke early this morning." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "She's gone, Jack. Our only living witness to what happened to Elizabeth." Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "When exactly did this happen?" "They found her at breakfast, around 7:30. Dylan looked up sharply. "Dad, that's right after we left Oakfield yesterday. Right after we talked to her." Jack placed a protective arm around his son's shoulders. It could be a coincidence. Harriet was 97 years old. But even as he said it, Jack didn't believe it was coincidental. The timing was too perfect, coming immediately after they had visited her and uncovered the truth about James Wheaton's parentage. "You need to be careful, Jack," Margaret said, lowering her voice. "Both of you. I've lived here my whole life and I've seen how the Wheatons operate. They protect their interests at any cost." "You think they'd harm us?" Jack asked, incredulous. Margaret's expression was grave. "I think a family that would help commit a young woman to an asylum and fake her death to get their hands on her property wouldn't hesitate to take extreme measures when threatened." "But that was almost a century ago," Jack protested. "Different people, different times." "The stakes are higher now," Margaret countered. "That timberland is worth millions. The Wheaton name carries weight throughout the state, and secrets that old, when exposed, can destroy more than just reputations." Inside the house, Jack and Dylan debated their next move. The confrontation with Douglas Wheaton had gone exactly as expected. Denial, anger, threats. But Harriet's sudden death had added a disturbing new dimension to their investigation. "Maybe we should go to the sheriff," Dylan suggested. "Show them what we've found." Jack shook his head. "And tell them what?" "That we suspect the Wheatons of tampering with property records 95 years ago. That we think they might have had something to do with a 97-year-old woman's natural death. The sheriff is elected, Dylan, in a county where the Wheatons are the largest employer and taxpayer. So we just give up. Let them get away with it." "I didn't say that." Jack paced the worn floorboards of his childhood home. "We need more concrete evidence. Something that proves fraud or conspiracy beyond just circumstantial connections." Dylan brightened. "What about DNA testing? If Douglas Wheaton is descended from Howard and Elizabeth Miller, a DNA test would prove it. That would require his cooperation, which seems unlikely at this point." Jack paused, though there might be another approach. If James Wheaton was adopted, there might be records somewhere. Not official adoption papers, since those were apparently suppressed, but perhaps medical records, school registrations, something that might indicate his true parentage. They spent the afternoon researching online, Dylan's laptop connected to the farm's weak but functional internet signal. Genealogy websites offered tantalizing fragments. Census records showing James Wheaton first appearing in the 1930 census as a 1-year-old son of Joseph and Eleanor Wheaton, though no birth records could be found. "It's like he just materialized," Dylan observed. "No birth certificate, no hospital records." "Which is consistent with a private adoption that the family wanted to keep secret," Jack noted. As evening fell, they took a break to prepare dinner. Through the kitchen window, Jack noticed a sheriff's department vehicle slowly driving past the farm, its headlights off despite the gathering darkness. When he stepped onto the porch for a better look, the vehicle accelerated away. "We're being watched," he told Dylan when he returned inside. The boy nodded grimly. "I figured as much. What do we do now?" Jack considered their options. They could leave Oakfield immediately, return to Minneapolis, and try to forget what they'd discovered. They could go public with their findings, risking legal action from the Wheatons for defamation. Or they could continue their investigation, seeking the one piece of evidence that might definitively prove their case. "I think," Jack said slowly, "we need to find out exactly what happened to Elizabeth Sinclair Miller. The newspaper reported she died in a car accident near Lake Geneva after leaving the sanitarium. But what if that wasn't true? What if, like so much else in this story, that was a fabrication?" Dylan frowned. "But how would we prove that after all this time? Newspaper archives, police reports if they still exist. We know the approximate date, August or September 1929. Jack's mind raced with possibilities, and we should try to locate the sanitarium records. Mount Haven closed in the 1950s, but their patient files must have gone somewhere. As they discussed possibilities, Jack's phone rang, an unknown number with a Chicago area code. Cautiously he answered. "Jack Miller?" a male voice asked. "Yes, who's this?" "My name is Benjamin Thorndike. I'm an attorney representing the Wheaton family interests. The voice was smooth, professional. Mr. Wheaton has asked me to contact you regarding your recent discoveries. Jack signaled to Dylan to be quiet. I'm listening. Mr. Wheaton has reconsidered his position. He's prepared to offer you $2 million for the Miller farm, twice its market value, with the understanding that all documents and information you've uncovered will be transferred to him as part of the sale. Jack blinked, startled by the amount. That's generous. Mr. Wheaton values his privacy and his family's reputation. He's willing to be generous to protect both. And if I decline? The attorney's tone remained pleasant. Mr. Wheaton has instructed me to inform you that pursuing these matters further could result in significant legal consequences. The documents you possess, if made public, could be construed as defamatory. Additionally, trespassing on the historical record of a prominent family opens you to liability for emotional distress, invasion of privacy, and potentially other civil penalties. Are you threatening me, Mr. Thorndyke? Not at all. I'm simply outlining potential legal realities. The attorney paused. Mr. Wheaton is offering a mutually beneficial resolution. You receive substantial compensation. He preserves his family's dignity. Everyone wins. Jack thought of Elizabeth, imprisoned in a sanitarium, separated from her husband and child, of Howard, searching desperately for his missing wife, of a baby boy taken from his mother's arms and given to strangers. I'll need time to consider the offer. Of course, Mr. Wheaton has authorized me to give you 24 hours. I'll call tomorrow evening for your answer. The line went dead. Dylan looked at his father expectantly. $2 million? That's crazy money, Dad. It's hush money, Jack corrected. Meant to buy our silence. But $2 million could change our lives. After the divorce and everything, Dylan trailed off, clearly torn between principle and practicality. Jack understood his son's conflict. The divorce had drained his savings, forced them to downsize their home, limited opportunities for Dylan's future education. $2 million would solve their financial challenges instantly. It's blood money, Dylan, earned through the suffering of Elizabeth Miller and the theft of her child and property. Jack shook his head firmly. Some things can't be bought. Dylan nodded slowly. I know. I just wanted to make sure you knew what you were turning down. Jack smiled at his son's maturity. I do, and I'm proud that you understand what's really important here. That night, as Dylan slept upstairs, Jack sat on the porch with his father's journal open in his lap. He'd been searching for any clue that Frank might have known about Howard's first marriage and child, any indication of whether his father had been complicit in keeping these secrets. Near the end of the journal, in entries from the last year of Frank's life, Jack found what he was looking for, a passage that changed everything. Douglas came by today, said it's time I knew the truth, with my health failing. Showed me documents proving his father James was actually Howard's son by his first wife. Said the land deal was part of the arrangement. The Wheatons got the timber property in exchange for taking in Howard's son and giving him a better life than a struggling farmer could provide. Howard agreed to stay silent, to forget Elizabeth and the boy, in exchange for knowing his son would be raised with advantages he couldn't offer. Douglas says it was all legal and above board, but if that's true, why keep it secret all these years? And why tell me now when I'm too sick to do anything about it? Jack read the passage multiple times, his hands trembling. His father had known, at least at the end. And more importantly, the entry confirmed what they had suspected. Howard had been coerced into giving up his rights to his son and the timber property, probably by Richard Sinclair and Joseph Wheaton working in concert. But something still didn't add up. If Douglas Wheaton had voluntarily revealed this history to Frank, why was he now so desperate to suppress it? What had changed? As Jack pondered this question, his gaze drifted to the photographs they'd found in the chest, images of Howard and Elizabeth in happier times. One photo showed them standing proudly in front of the farmhouse, Elizabeth's hand resting protectively over her belly. Behind them, clearly visible in the background, stood the barn with its distinctive roofline and cupola. Jack frowned, looking more closely at the photograph. The barn in the picture wasn't the same structure that stood on their property now. The current barn had been rebuilt after the fire of 1952 with a different design. Suddenly, Jack remembered his father's journal entry, told him the chest was lost in the barn fire of 52. That seemed to satisfy him. If Frank had lied about the chest being destroyed, what else might he have concealed in that rebuilt barn? Jack grabbed a flashlight and walked quickly across the dark yard to the barn. Inside, he made his way to the hidden storage room where they had found the chest. Looking around with fresh eyes, he noticed that while the room appeared to be a simple storage closet, its dimensions seemed off compared to the exterior walls of the barn. Tapping the back wall produced a hollow sound. Jack examined it more carefully, finding a nearly invisible seam where the wooden panels met. Pushing experimentally, he felt the wall give slightly. With mounting excitement, Jack applied more pressure. The section of wall swung inward on concealed hinges, revealing a small hidden space beyond. Inside was a metal lockbox, dusty with age but intact. Jack carried it back to the house, his heart pounding. The box was locked, but the key, a small ordinary-looking key unlike the ornate one for the safety deposit box, was taped to the bottom with a yellowed note in Frank's handwriting. In case the truth ever needs telling. Inside the box, Jack found what his father had hidden, the smoking gun they needed. Letters between Richard Sinclair and Joseph Wheaton discussing the arrangement regarding Elizabeth's baby and the timber property. A signed agreement wherein Howard relinquished all claims to his son in exchange for the promise that James would be well cared for and educated. Most damning of all, a confession written by Eleanor Wheaton on her deathbed in 1957, admitting that she and Joseph had participated in a conspiracy to separate Elizabeth from her husband and child, to commit her to Mount Haven, and ultimately to fake her death after she had escaped the sanitarium. According to Eleanor's confession, Elizabeth had not died in a car accident. She had successfully escaped and had been making her way back to Oakfield when Joseph Wheaton and Richard Sinclair's men intercepted her. Rather than risk another escape, they had staged the accident, while the real Elizabeth had been taken to a private facility in Minnesota under a false name, where she remained until her actual death from pneumonia in 1931, never knowing that her husband had given up searching for her, believing the reports of her death. Jack sat at the kitchen table until dawn, reading and rereading these documents. They provided incontrovertible proof of a conspiracy spanning decades, involving multiple generations of Wheatons. The timber property had never legally passed to the Wheatons. It had been stolen through deception and fraud, with Howard's reluctant cooperation secured through what amounted to emotional blackmail, the promise that his son would have opportunities Howard couldn't provide. When Dylan came downstairs for breakfast, Jack showed him what he had found. The boy's eyes widened as he grasped the implications. "So we have proof, real proof?" Jack nodded. "Yes. The question is, what do we do with it? Are you following this intense family drama? Hit subscribe and turn on notifications to find out what Jack and Dylan decide to do with this shocking evidence. What would you do if you discovered a decades-old family conspiracy? Share your thoughts in the comments below. By mid-morning, Jack and Dylan had spread the documents across the kitchen table, organizing them chronologically to create a complete timeline of events. The story they revealed was both tragic and infuriating. A calculated conspiracy to separate Elizabeth from her husband and child, to commit her to an asylum against her will, and ultimately to fake her death when she proved too determined to escape. "It's like something from a movie," Dylan said, shaking his head in disbelief. "They actually got away with this for almost 100 years. Jack nodded grimly. "Money and influence can buy a lot of silence. So what do we do now? We have until this evening to respond to their offer." Jack stared out the window at the familiar landscape of the farm, fields stretching to the horizon, the weathered red barn, the oak tree where he'd built a treehouse as a boy. Coming back had been meant to be a temporary stop, a chance to settle his father's affairs before returning to their life in Minneapolis. Now everything had changed. "I think," he said slowly, "we need to understand what Douglas Wheaton is really afraid of. It's not just the land. The timber property is valuable, but the Wheatons have plenty of money and land already. And it's not just the scandal of adoption or illegitimacy. Those kinds of revelations hardly raise eyebrows these days." Dylan frowned. "So what is he afraid of?" "Criminal liability," Jack suggested. "Conspiracy, fraud, maybe even worse if they were directly involved in Elizabeth's death. The statute of limitations has expired for most crimes from that era, but there could still be civil liabilities. And more importantly, there's the court of public opinion. You think we should go public with this?" Jack considered the question carefully. "Not necessarily, but I do think we should use what we know to negotiate with Douglas Wheaton from a position of strength rather than fear." While Dylan researched land values and legal precedents online, Jack called his real estate attorney friend again, this time explaining the full situation. "You're sitting on a legal powder keg, Jack," his friend said, after hearing the details. "These documents could potentially support claims of fraud, conspiracy, and wrongful death even after all this time. The problem is proving damages after nearly a century." "I'm not interested in a lawsuit," Jack clarified. "I'm trying to understand my leverage before meeting with Wheaton again. Substantial, I'd say. Wisconsin has no statute of limitations for fraud that prevents the discovery of the fraud. If you can prove the Wheatons actively concealed these facts to maintain control of the property, you might have a viable claim, but litigation would be expensive and time-consuming with uncertain results." "And if I were interested in a settlement instead? With the evidence you describe, you could probably negotiate something significant. But be careful, Jack. People who have kept secrets this long can be dangerous when cornered." After ending the call, Jack found Dylan watching him expectantly. "You've decided something, haven't you?" Jack nodded. "I think it's time to have another conversation with Douglas Wheaton, but this time we'll set the terms." Rather than calling Wheaton's attorney, Jack texted Douglas directly. "We need to talk. Not about money, about family. My place, 2 p.m. The response came almost immediately. "I have nothing more to say to you." Jack replied simply, "Eleanor's confession." Then he waited. 3 minutes later, his phone rang. "What are you talking about?" Wheaton demanded, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I think you know. Your grandmother's deathbed confession about what really happened to Elizabeth Miller, about how she didn't die in that car accident." A long silence followed. When Wheaton spoke again, his voice had lost its edge. 2 o'clock. I'll be there." Jack spent the next 2 hours preparing, organizing the documents in a specific order to tell the most compelling story. He made copies of everything, storing the originals in a secure location, not in the house or barn where they might be vulnerable. At precisely 2 p.m., Douglas Wheaton's Mercedes pulled into the driveway. This time he wasn't alone. Deputy Eric Wheaton emerged from the passenger side, in uniform, but clearly not on official business. "Bringing backup?" Jack asked as they approached the porch where he waited. Douglas Wheaton's expression was grim. "Family meeting. Seems appropriate given the circumstances." Inside, Jack had arranged the dining room table with 4 chairs and a pitcher of iced tea, a gesture of hospitality that seemed to momentarily disarm the Wheatons. Dylan sat already, his posture tense but resolute. Once everyone was seated, Jack spoke directly. "I appreciate you coming, Mr. Wheaton. And you, Deputy. Before we begin, I want to be clear about my intentions. I'm not looking to destroy your family or to extract a fortune. I'm looking for acknowledgement and restitution." Douglas Wheaton's expression remained carefully neutral. "You mentioned Eleanor's confession. I'd like to see it." Jack slid a folder across the table. "This contains copies of everything we've found, including documents hidden by my father in a secret compartment in the barn. Letters between Richard Sinclair and Joseph Wheaton, the agreement Howard Miller signed relinquishing rights to his son, and yes, Eleanor Wheaton's confession regarding the conspiracy to separate Elizabeth from her family and fake her death." As Douglas Wheaton read through the documents, his face paled. Beside him, Eric leaned in, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "Grandma Eleanor wrote this?" Eric asked, pointing to the confession. Douglas nodded tightly. "Appears to be her handwriting." "So it's true," Eric said softly. "We're actually Millers by blood." Douglas shot his nephew a warning look. "This changes nothing about who we are, Eric." "It changes everything," the younger Wheaton countered. "If these documents are legitimate, and they certainly look it, our entire family history is based on a lie. Worse, on criminal acts against innocent people." Jack watched the interplay between the Wheatons with interest. He hadn't anticipated Eric might be an ally, but the deputy's reaction suggested he placed truth above family loyalty, at least in matters of this magnitude. "These documents are absolutely genuine," Jack confirmed. "And I think you know that, Mr. Wheaton. Your reaction confirms it." Douglas Wheaton closed the folder with deliberate calm. "What exactly do you want, Miller? Money? The timber property? Public apology?" "Justice," Jack replied simply. "For Elizabeth Sinclair Miller, for Howard Miller, and for their son James, your father, whom Howard gave up believing it was best for the boy." "Justice after nearly a century," Wheaton scoffed. "What would that even look like?" "I've given that considerable thought," Jack said. sliding a second folder across the table. "This contains my proposal, a comprehensive settlement that addresses the historical wrongs while preserving the Wheaton family's dignity." Douglas opened the folder cautiously, reading Jack's typed proposal with increasing surprise. Eric leaned over to read alongside his uncle, his eyebrows rising as he absorbed the details. "You can't be serious," Douglas said finally. "This is—" "Reasonable," Eric finished for him. "More than reasonable, Uncle Doug. It's actually kind." Jack's proposal was straightforward. The Wheaton family would acknowledge the true heritage of James Wheaton as the son of Howard and Elizabeth Miller. A portion of the timber property, specifically the 30 acres adjoining the original Miller farm, would be returned to Jack as the heir of Howard Miller. The Wheaton family would establish a scholarship fund in Elizabeth Sinclair Miller's name at the local community college, supporting young women pursuing education despite economic or social obstacles. Finally, the full historical record, including all documents found by Jack and Dylan, would be donated to the County Historical Society, ensuring the truth was preserved for future generations. In exchange, Jack would sign a covenant not to pursue any legal claims against the Wheaton family or their businesses, and would acknowledge that the current generation of Wheatons bore no responsibility for actions taken by their ancestors. The Miller farm would remain in Jack's possession, not to be sold to developers. "You don't want money?" Douglas asked incredulously. Jack shook his head. "This isn't about money. It's about setting things right, as much as possible after all this time." "The timber property is worth millions," Douglas pointed out. "You're only asking for 30 acres. The 30 acres that connect to the original farm, the land that should have stayed in the Miller family." Jack leaned forward. "Mr. Wheaton, I understand this is difficult. Your entire life you've believed a certain narrative about your family history. Now you've discovered it's more complicated." "Complicated," Wheaton repeated with a bitter laugh. "That's one word for it. But it's also an opportunity," Jack continued. "An opportunity to embrace a fuller truth about who you are. You're not just a Wheaton, you're also a Miller. Your grandfather was the son of a farmer who loved so deeply he spent years searching for his lost wife and child. There's no shame in that heritage." Eric Wheaton nodded slowly. "He's right, Uncle Doug. This could be a chance to heal old wounds, to unite families that should never have been separated." Douglas stared at his nephew. "How you're taking his side?" "I'm on the side of truth," Eric replied quietly. "As a law enforcement officer, I can't ignore evidence of wrongdoing, even historical wrongdoing. As a Wheaton, I want to know my true heritage." A tense silence filled the room as Douglas Wheaton visibly struggled with his decision. Jack could almost see the calculations running through the older man's mind, weighing potential scandal against the prospect of closure, financial implications against family legacy. "The scholarship fund," Wheaton said finally. "How much would you expect us to endow it with?" "Enough to make a meaningful difference," Jack replied. $1 million seems appropriate, given the value of the timber property over the decades." Wheaton nodded thoughtfully. "And the historical record, you really want all this made public? The confessions, the conspiracy, all of it?" "I think Elizabeth and Howard's story deserves to be told," Jack said. "But I'm open to discussing how it's presented. The focus could be on reconciliation and healing, not just on exposing past wrongs." Douglas turned to his nephew. "What do you think, Eric?" The deputy considered for a moment. "I think it's fair. More than fair. And I think Grandpa James would have wanted to know the truth about his parents. Maybe he did know, toward the end." "He suspected," Douglas admitted reluctantly. "In his later years, he asked questions about his birth parents, mentioned dreams about a farm and a woman singing to him. I always dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man." His expression softened with regret. "I should have listened." Jack sensed the shift in Wheaton's demeanor, a crack in the armor of denial and defensiveness. "We can't change the past, Mr. Wheaton, but we can choose how we honor it and how we move forward from here." Douglas Wheaton stared out the window at the Miller farm, land that his biological great-grandfather had worked, land connected to a heritage he had denied. Finally, he turned back to Jack. "I need time to consult with my attorneys to review these terms properly, but provisionally, I find your proposal acceptable." He extended his hand across the table. "You're a better man than I gave you credit for, Miller." Jack shook the offered hand. "We're family, Mr. Wheaton. Distant cousins, technically. I think it's time we started acting like it." After the Wheatons departed, Dylan let out a whoop of excitement. "Dad, that was amazing! Did you see their faces when you showed them Eleanor's confession?" Jack smiled, the tension of the confrontation finally easing from his shoulders. "I think we found the right approach. Not vindictive, not greedy, just focused on acknowledging the truth and making reasonable amends. So we're staying, keeping the farm." Jack looked around the old house, the worn floorboards, the faded wallpaper, the marks on the doorframe tracking his childhood growth. For the first time since returning, he felt a sense of belonging, of continuity with the past. "Yes, I think we are, at least for now. There's something powerful about reconnecting with your roots, understanding the stories that made you who you are." He ruffled Dylan's hair affectionately. "What do you think about that? Could you handle country living for a while?" Dylan considered the question seriously. "It's growing on me, and there's a lot more to do on a farm than I thought. Plus, the internet situation is improving." He grinned. "And we have family history to explore, our real family history." Over the next week, negotiations with the Wheaton family proceeded more smoothly than Jack had anticipated. Douglas Wheaton, once he accepted the inevitability of confronting the past, proved to be a practical negotiator, focused on preserving as much of his family's reputation as possible while acknowledging the historical wrongs. The settlement was finalized with a few modifications. The scholarship fund would bear both the Miller and Wheaton names, symbolizing the joined heritage of the families. The historical documents would be sealed for 5 years before being made public, giving the Wheatons time to prepare their extended family for the revelations. And most significantly, Eric Wheaton would serve as a liaison between the families, helping to bridge the decades-long divide. On a crisp autumn morning, 2 weeks after their initial discovery of the chest, Jack and Dylan stood with Douglas and Eric Wheaton at the small Oakfield Cemetery, where they had arranged for a proper memorial marker for Elizabeth Sinclair Miller. The simple granite stone read, "Elizabeth Sinclair Miller, 1908-1931, beloved wife and mother. Love endures beyond all obstacles." As they stood in respectful silence, Jack reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun as a simple task, clearing out an old farmhouse to sell, had become a profound exploration of identity, justice, and the enduring power of truth. Douglas Wheaton stepped forward, placing a bouquet of white roses on the memorial. "For my grandmother," he said quietly, "whom I never knew, but whose blood runs in my veins." Jack placed a hand on Dylan's shoulder, feeling an unexpected sense of peace. Elizabeth's story had finally been told. Howard's search had, in a way, finally ended, and 2 families, separated by deception and greed, had begun the process of healing. "What happens now?" Dylan asked as they walked back to their vehicles. "Now," Jack replied, "we build something new on the foundation of truth, together." Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications if you've enjoyed this journey. What do you think about Jack's solution? Was it fair to all parties? Share your thoughts in the comments below. 1 year later, the October morning dawned crisp and clear as Jack stepped onto the porch of the farmhouse, coffee mug in hand. The maple trees lining the driveway had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, and the freshly painted white farmhouse gleamed in the autumn sunshine. So much had changed in the year since they had discovered the locked chest in the barn. What had begun as a temporary stay to prepare the property for sale had evolved into a complete life transformation. Jack had taken a leave of absence from his architectural firm in Minneapolis, eventually transitioning to remote work that allowed him to remain in Oakfield. Dylan had adapted to rural life with surprising enthusiasm, throwing himself into farm projects and excelling at the small local high school. "Morning, Dad," Dylan called, emerging from the barn where he'd been feeding the small collection of animals they'd acquired. 2 horses, a dozen chickens, and a surprisingly affectionate goat named Howard, after his great-great-grandfather. "Morning. Ready for the big day?" Dylan nodded, his expression a mix of excitement and solemnity. "Everything's prepared." Eric called. "The Wheatons are all coming, even the cousins from Chicago." Today marked the formal dedication of the Elizabeth Sinclair Miller Scholarship Foundation and the unveiling of a historical marker on the property where the timberlands adjoined the original Miller farm. It would be the first public acknowledgement of the connected heritage of the Miller and Wheaton families, a carefully orchestrated event that Douglas Wheaton had initially resisted but eventually embraced with characteristic thoroughness. As Jack sipped his coffee, he reflected on the unexpected turn their lives had taken. The settlement with the Wheatons had been only the beginning. The 30 acres of timber property returned to the Millers had become a joint conservation project, with Jack and Douglas working together to create a nature preserve that would remain undeveloped in perpetuity. The Scholarship Foundation had been established with a $1.5 million endowment, more generous than Jack had requested, and would support its first recipients this fall. Most surprisingly, the relationship between the Millers and Wheatons had evolved from cautious détente to genuine connection. Eric Wheaton had become a regular visitor to the farm, fascinated by his newfound Miller heritage. Even Douglas, initially resistant to acknowledging the familial bond, had gradually softened, sharing family photographs and stories that took on new meaning in light of the revealed truth. "Dad," Dylan called, interrupting Jack's thoughts. "Margaret's here." Margaret Wilson made her way up the path, spry despite her years. Since the discoveries of last autumn, she had become an invaluable resource, filling in gaps in the family history and providing context for the documents they had found. "Beautiful day for a dedication," she observed, joining Jack on the porch. "Elizabeth would have approved, I think." Jack nodded. "I hope so. Sometimes I wonder what she would make of all this, her story finally told after all these years, her son's descendants reconciled with her husband's family." "She'd be pleased," Margaret said confidently. Elizabeth was a bridge builder, according to Harriet. She believed in healing divides, not creating them. The mention of Harriet Jenkins brought a momentary shadow. Although they had never proven any connection between the Wheatons and her sudden death, Jack and Dylan had arranged for a proper memorial service and had included her story in the historical record they'd compiled. By mid-morning, cars began arriving for the dedication ceremony. Local officials, community members, and most significantly, representatives from both the Miller and Wheaton extended families gathered on the property line, where the simple granite marker had been installed. Jack had worried that some of the Wheatons might boycott the event, unwilling to acknowledge the revised family narrative. But Douglas had been thorough in his preparations, personally meeting with relatives to explain the discoveries and the settlement. While a few had initially resisted, curiosity about their true heritage had eventually overcome reluctance. As the crowd gathered, Jack spotted Douglas Wheaton standing somewhat apart, impeccably dressed as always, but with a new hint of humanity in his bearing. Catching Jack's eye, he nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement that would have been unthinkable a year ago. The ceremony itself was simple but moving. Jack spoke briefly about Elizabeth and Howard's love story, their tragic